Karen lived in a peaceful suburban neighborhood where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, colorful flower beds, and houses that seemed to whisper stories of happy families. Everyone knew each other here. Well, at least enough to exchange polite waves or casual greetings over the fence. But Karen was different from most of her neighbors. She had strong opinions about almost everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Some people thought she cared deeply about the community, while others found her overwhelming and even a little intimidating. Karen's home sat right in the middle of the block, its exterior always spotless, with not a single weed daring to poke through her perfectly manicured garden. To Karen, her house wasn't just a place to live. It was a reflection of who she was, or at least who she wanted others to think she was. And because she took so much pride in her property, she expected everyone else to do the same. If someone's grass grew too long or their trash cans were left out for an extra day, Karen noticed. Oh, how she noticed. Lately, though, one neighbor had been occupying most of Karen's thoughts. Mr. Thompson. He lived alone at the end of the street in a modest house that showed signs of wear and tear. The paint on his shutters was peeling, and his front yard occasionally hosted stray leaves blown in by the wind. To Karen, this was unacceptable. "He doesn't care about our neighborhood," she muttered to herself as she walked past his house one afternoon. In her mind, Mr. Thompson's lack of effort was dragging down the entire community. But what bothered Karen more than his unkempt yard was his apparent disregard for her complaints. Over the past few months, she'd sent letters to the homeowners association, made calls to city officials, and even knocked on his door several times to voice her concerns. Each time, Mr. Thompson listened quietly, nodded politely, and promised to address the issues. But nothing ever changed. At least, not to Karen's satisfaction. What Karen didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Mr. Thompson wasn't ignoring her requests out of laziness or spite. The truth was, he was elderly and unwell. Years of battling chronic health problems had left him frail and dependent on medical equipment to get through each day. Maintaining his house had become less of a priority, when simply breathing required all his energy. Still, he tried to keep things tidy, knowing full well how important appearances were to some of his neighbors. Despite his efforts, Karen remained unsatisfied. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, growing hotter with every passing week. She began to see Mr. Thompson not just as a nuisance, but as a personal affront to her values. How dare he let his property fall into disrepair? Didn't he realize how much it affected everyone around him? These questions swirled in her mind like a storm, clouding her judgment and fueling her anger. One evening, after yet another fruitless conversation with Mr. Thompson, Karen stormed back to her house, muttering under her breath. As she slammed her front door shut, something inside her snapped. Enough was enough. If Mr. Thompson wouldn't fix his problems, then maybe she'd have to show him exactly how serious she was. Little did she know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever and expose the dark side of her relentless determination. Karen's frustration with Mr. Thompson had reached its boiling point. Every time she drove past his house, her eyes darted to the chipped paint on the porch railing or the pile of leaves gathered near the curb. To her, these small imperfections weren't just eyesores. They were a personal insult. She couldn't understand why someone would let their property fall into such disarray, especially when it affected the entire neighborhood. In Karen's mind, Mr. Thompson wasn't just neglecting his home. He was disrespecting everyone around him. But there was something else about Mr. Thompson that irritated Karen even more. His calm demeanor. No matter how loudly she complained or how forcefully she made her case, he always responded with quiet patience. He never raised his voice, never argued back, and never seemed fazed by her accusations. It was as if he didn't take her seriously. And that infuriated her. How could he act so indifferent when she was clearly in the right? The tension between them came to a head one evening during a heated argument outside Mr. Thompson's driveway. Karen had marched over to confront him yet again, this time armed with a list of grievances she'd scribbled down earlier. "Your yard is a mess," she began, jabbing a finger in his direction. "And those leaves. They'd blow onto my lawn every single day. Do you even care about anyone but yourself?" Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, leaning slightly on his cane for support. His frail frame and weathered face told a story of years spent battling health issues, but Karen didn't notice, or maybe she didn't want to. "I'm doing the best I can," he said softly, his voice steady despite the confrontation. "I don't mean to cause any trouble." Karen scoffed at his response. "Doing your best? That's not good enough. You're dragging down the whole neighborhood." Her words spilled out faster now, each sentence sharper than the last. Passers-by slowed their steps to watch the exchange, but Karen didn't care. All that mattered was making Mr. Thompson understand just how wrong he was. As the argument wore on, Mr. Thompson grew quieter, his expression unreadable. Finally, he simply nodded and turned to go inside, closing the door gently behind him. For Karen, this felt like the ultimate dismissal. How dare he walk away from her? Didn't he realize how hard she worked to keep the neighborhood beautiful? The injustice of it all burned inside her chest, hotter than ever before. That night, unable to sleep, Karen paced her living room, replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson thought he was above the rules, that he believed he didn't have to answer to anyone. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Something needed to change, and soon. But what could she do? Letters and complaints hadn't worked. Talking to him directly only made things worse. What else was left? Then an idea began to form, a reckless, dangerous idea. At first, Karen pushed it aside, horrified by the thought. But the longer she dwelled on it, the more it took hold. Maybe, just maybe, if she gave Mr. Thompson a little taste of his own medicine, he'd finally get the message. After all, desperate times called for desperate measures, right? Little did Karen know, her plan would spiral far beyond anything she could have imagined. As she sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, staring at the clock ticking away, she failed to consider the consequences of her actions, or the fact that some secrets are impossible to keep hidden. The night was darker than usual, with thick clouds covering the moon and casting long shadows across Mr. Thompson's yard. Karen stood at the edge of his property, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent hours convincing herself that this was the only way to make him understand. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small flashlight and a pair of scissors tucked into her pocket. This wasn't like her. She knew that deep down, but anger had clouded her judgment, pushing her toward something she never thought she'd do. Karen glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. The street was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of crickets breaking the silence. Most of the houses nearby were dark, their occupants fast asleep. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes might be on her. She pulled her hood tighter over her head, hoping it would help conceal her identity if anyone happened to look out their window. Her first challenge was getting inside. Karen had noticed during previous visits that Mr. Thompson kept a side gate unlocked for convenience, likely because of his age and frailty. It was risky, but she decided to take her chances. Creeping along the fence line, she slipped through the gate without a sound. Once inside, she paused, listening intently for any signs of movement. The house loomed ahead of her, its windows dark except for a faint glow coming from what she assumed was the living room. Karen moved cautiously toward the basement door, which she remembered seeing during one of her earlier confrontations with Mr. Thompson. He had mentioned once that his oxygen machine was kept down there. It was too noisy to have upstairs. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to the detail, but now it played perfectly into her plan. As she reached the door, she hesitated again, her mind screaming at her to turn back. But the image of his messy yard flashed in her mind, fueling her determination. The basement stairs creaked softly under her weight as she descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew cooler and smelled faintly of dampness. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves stacked with old books, tools, and boxes covered in dust. In the corner, she spotted the humming machine, a bulky device with tubes snaking out from it. This was it, the source of Mr. Thompson's dependence, the thing keeping him alive. Karen's breath hitched as she approached the machine. Up close, it looked more complicated than she'd imagined, with buttons, dials, and wires everywhere. But her focus zeroed in on the main oxygen line running from the machine to a mask resting on a nearby table. That's what she needed to cut. Just one snip, and he'd feel the consequences of ignoring her demands. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the scissors, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handles. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if this went too far? What if someone found out? But then she remembered all the times Mr. Thompson had dismissed her complaints, all the days she'd stared at his unkempt yard, seething with frustration. No, she told herself firmly. He deserved this. If he wanted to act like he didn't care about the neighborhood, then maybe losing his precious oxygen would teach him a lesson. With a deep breath, Karen leaned closer to the machine. Her pulse roared in her ears as she positioned the scissors over the tubing. Just as she was about to make the cut, a soft noise behind her made her freeze. Was that footsteps? She spun around, shining her flashlight toward the staircase, but saw nothing. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Shaking off the paranoia, Karen turned back to the task at hand. She didn't realize that mounted high on the wall above her, a tiny red light blinked steadily, recording every move she made. Karen's fingers tightened around the scissors as she steadied herself. The basement was eerily quiet now, save for the faint hum of the oxygen machine in front of her. Her mind raced with thoughts. What if Mr. Thompson woke up? What if someone saw her sneaking out? But then she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message. If he couldn't breathe properly, maybe he'd finally understand how much his negligence affected others. Maybe he'd realize that living in this neighborhood came with responsibilities. With one last glance over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching, Karen pressed the blades of the scissors against the oxygen line. It took more effort than she expected. The tubing was thicker and tougher than it looked, but after a few tense seconds, she felt it give way. The hum of the machine sputtered and died, leaving an unsettling silence in its place. For a moment, Karen stood frozen, staring at the severed line as reality began to sink in. She had done it. There was no turning back now. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, partly from adrenaline and partly from fear. What had she just done? Cutting the oxygen line seemed like a harmless scare tactic when she first thought of it, but standing there in the dark basement, surrounded by the evidence of her actions, it suddenly felt much bigger, much scarier. She shook her head, trying to push those thoughts aside. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting out of there before anyone noticed. As quietly as she could, Karen retraced her steps, slipping past shelves stacked with tools and old boxes. She moved slowly, careful not to knock anything over or make any noise that might alert Mr. Thompson upstairs. Each creak of the wooden stairs felt deafening in the stillness of the night. When she finally reached the top, she paused again, listening for any sign of movement. The house remained silent, but Karen's nerves were on edge. Every shadow seemed to shift suspiciously. Every sound made her jump. She slipped through the side gate the same way she'd come in, pulling it shut gently behind her. The cool night air hit her face as she hurried back toward her own house, her hood still pulled low over her forehead. Her hands trembled as she shoved the scissors into her pocket, wishing she could leave them, and the memory of what she'd done, behind altogether. As she walked, her mind replayed the scene in the basement over and over again. Had she gone too far? No, she told herself firmly. Mr. Thompson would be fine. He probably had backup oxygen tanks or some other safety measure in place. Besides, she hadn't meant to hurt him, just to teach him a lesson. But even as she tried to reassure herself, doubt lingered. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. Still, Karen pushed the feeling aside. By the time she reached her front door, she had convinced herself that everything would work out. Mr. Thompson would wake up, realize his oxygen was cut off, and call someone to fix it. And once he did, he'd think twice before ignoring her complaints ever again. That's all she wanted, right? Unbeknownst to Karen, however, her every move had been captured on camera. Mr. Thompson's upgraded security system had recorded everything, from the moment she entered through the side gate to the exact second she cut the oxygen line. The tiny red light blinking steadily above her in the basement hadn't registered in her panicked state, but it had been there, silently documenting her crime. And while Karen believed she had gotten away with it, the truth was already waiting to catch up with her. Back inside her house, Karen peeled off her hoodie and collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with a mix of relief and unease. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night in her mind. For now, she felt safe, but little did she know, the weight of her actions would soon come crashing down on her in ways she never imagined. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Mr. Thompson's home as he slowly stirred awake. At first, everything seemed normal. His alarm clock ticked softly on the bedside table, and the faint chirping of birds outside signaled the start of a new day. But within moments, something felt off. His chest tightened uncomfortably, and each breath came slower and shallower than before. Panic began to creep in as he reached instinctively for his oxygen mask, only to find it lifeless and unresponsive. No air flowed through the tube. Mr. Thompson's mind raced. What was happening? He fumbled for his emergency call button, pressing it repeatedly until he heard the reassuring voice of an operator on the other end. "I can't breathe," he gasped into the speaker, his words strained and desperate. Within minutes, paramedics were dispatched to his home. They arrived quickly, their boots thudding against the wooden floors as they rushed to his side. After checking his vitals, they discovered the severed oxygen line in the basement and immediately restored his airflow using backup equipment they carried with them. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him, Mr. Thompson's thoughts turned to how this could have happened. The machine had been working perfectly fine the night before. He was sure of it. Someone must have tampered with it. But who? And why? His mind drifted to Karen, her angry words echoing in his memory. Could she really be capable of something like this? Once the immediate danger had passed and he was able to think more clearly, Mr. Thompson decided to review the footage from his security cameras. He had installed the system not long ago after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood, never imagining it would capture something so shocking. Sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop open, he scrolled through the recordings from the previous night. When the timestamp aligned with the early hours of the morning, his stomach sank. There she was, Karen, sneaking into his house under the cover of darkness, her face illuminated by the glow of her flashlight. He watched in stunned silence as the video showed her cutting the oxygen line, her movements deliberate and calculated. For a moment, Mr. Thompson simply stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. Karen had always been difficult, but this went far beyond anything he could have anticipated. She wasn't just complaining about his yard anymore. She had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. Her actions weren't just reckless. They were dangerous. And if the paramedics hadn't arrived when they did, the outcome could have been far worse. Determined to bring the truth to light, Mr. Thompson contacted the police right away. He explained the situation calmly, sharing the footage with the officers who arrived at his doorstep shortly afterward. As they reviewed the video, their expressions grew increasingly serious. It didn't take long for them to realize the gravity of what they were dealing with. Cutting an oxygen line wasn't just vandalism. It was an act that put someone's life in direct jeopardy. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood once news of Karen's arrest made headlines. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering about what had happened. Some expressed disbelief, struggling to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the person shown on camera. Others admitted they weren't surprised, citing her domineering personality and tendency to escalate conflicts over trivial matters. Despite the shockwaves rippling through the community, one thing was clear. Karen's actions had consequences, and those consequences were catching up to her. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson sat quietly on his porch, watching the commotion unfold. He felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and even a strange sense of relief. Relief that he was still alive, yes, but also relief that the truth was finally out in the open. He hoped this incident would serve as a wake-up call, not just for Karen, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Sometimes disputes go too far, and lines are crossed that can never be uncrossed. For now, though, all Mr. Thompson wanted was peace and justice for what had been done to him. When the police arrived at Karen's house later that afternoon, she was completely unprepared for what was about to happen. She had spent the morning convincing herself that everything was fine, that no one would ever connect her to the incident at Mr. Thompson's house. After all, she had been careful, hadn't she? She'd worn dark clothes, avoided the front-facing cameras, and slipped in and out of his home without making a sound. How could anyone possibly know it was her? But as soon as she opened her front door and saw the two officers standing there, her confidence began to crumble. "Karen," one of them said firmly, holding up a badge, "we need to speak with you about an ongoing investigation." Her heart skipped a beat. Investigation. What did they mean? She forced a smile, trying to appear calm, but her voice betrayed her nerves. "Of course. Officers, come in." Inside, the officers wasted no time getting to the point. They explained that someone had tampered with Mr. Thompson's oxygen equipment overnight, putting his life in serious danger. At first, Karen played dumb, shaking her head in mock concern. "That's terrible," she said, her tone laced with fake sympathy. "Is he okay?" The officers exchanged a glance before pulling out their tablets. "Actually, we have security footage from his home that shows exactly who broke in and cut the line," one of them said, turning the screen toward her. Karen's stomach dropped as she watched the video play. There she was, clear as day, sneaking into the basement, cutting the oxygen tube, and slipping back out again. Every detail was captured: her face, her movements, even the scissors in her hand. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one was supposed to find out. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, anything that might justify her actions. I didn't mean to hurt him," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just wanted to scare him, to make him listen to me." The officers listened patiently but showed no sympathy. "Ms. Karen," one of them said, his voice firm, "what you did is extremely serious. Tampering with medical equipment isn't just vandalism. It's attempted murder. You put Mr. Thompson's life at risk." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Attempted murder. That sounded so much worse than anything she had imagined when she came up with her plan. She tried to defend herself, claiming she never intended for things to go this far, but her excuses fell flat. Intentions didn't change the facts. Neighbors gathered outside Karen's house as the officers escorted her to their patrol car. Some looked on in disbelief, while others whispered among themselves, sharing stories of her past behavior. One woman muttered, "I always thought she took things too far, but I never expected this." Another neighbor shook his head, saying, "It's sad when disagreements get out of control like this." Karen kept her head down as she climbed into the back seat of the car, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Tears streamed down her face as reality set in. She wasn't just in trouble. She was facing charges that could change her life forever. At trial, Karen's lawyer argued that her actions were born out of frustration, not malice. He claimed she had simply lost her temper and acted impulsively, not realizing the severity of what she was doing. But the prosecution countered with undeniable evidence: the chilling surveillance footage, expert testimony about the dangers of cutting an oxygen line, and Mr. Thompson's own account of how close he had come to losing his life. When the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts, the courtroom fell silent. Karen sat motionless, staring at the floor as the weight of her choices crashed down on her. In the end, justice was served. Karen received a lengthy prison sentence, along with mandatory counseling aimed at addressing her inability to manage anger and conflict appropriately. As she was led away in handcuffs, Mr. Thompson watched silently from the gallery, his expression unreadable. While he felt relieved that the ordeal was finally over, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the woman who had let her frustrations spiral so dangerously out of control. For Karen, the road ahead would be long and difficult, a painful reminder of how quickly unchecked emotions can lead to devastating consequences. In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest and trial, the neighborhood began to feel different. The once quiet streets buzzed with whispered conversations about what had happened. Some people expressed shock at how far Karen had gone, while others admitted they weren't entirely surprised given her history of confrontations. But one thing was certain: no one would ever look at her, or their community, the same way again. For Mr. Thompson, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though the memory of that night lingered like a shadow. He continued his routine of sitting on his porch each morning, sipping tea and watching the world go by. Yet now, there was a new weight in his heart, a mix of gratitude for surviving and sadness over how quickly anger and entitlement could spiral into something so destructive. Despite everything, he didn't harbor hatred toward Karen. Instead, he felt pity for her, wondering how someone could let resentment consume them to such an extent. Determined to turn the ordeal into something positive, Mr. Thompson became an advocate for elder safety and awareness. He shared his story with local newspapers and even spoke at community meetings, urging others to take precautions like installing security systems and checking on elderly neighbors. "It's not just about protecting ourselves," he told a small crowd gathered in the park one afternoon. "It's about looking out for each other. None of us should have to face danger alone." His words resonated deeply, inspiring many residents to strengthen bonds within the neighborhood. Meanwhile, behind bars, Karen struggled to come to terms with her actions. Prison life was harsh and isolating, a stark contrast to the comfort and control she had once known. During mandatory counseling sessions, she was forced to confront the reasons behind her behavior, the insecurities, frustrations, and need for validation that had driven her to act recklessly. At first, she resisted, insisting she wasn't a bad person, only someone who made a terrible mistake. Over time, however, she began to see the truth. Her inability to manage conflict had hurt not only Mr. Thompson, but also herself. Letters from home were rare, mostly from distant relatives who urged her to reflect and grow. One letter, written by a childhood friend, stood out. "Karen," it read, "you've always been passionate, but passion without direction can lead you astray. Use this time to figure out who you want to be moving forward." Those words stayed with her, replaying in her mind during quiet moments. For the first time in years, Karen started thinking about the kind of person she wanted to become, not just for herself, but for the sake of those around her. Back in the neighborhood, the scars left by Karen's actions began to heal, though reminders remained. Mr. Thompson's house still bore the marks of age, but he took small steps to improve its appearance, encouraged by supportive neighbors who often stopped by to lend a hand. Together, they planted flowers in his garden and painted his porch railing, transforming the space into something brighter and more welcoming. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of community coming together after hardship. As months turned into years, news of Karen's release from prison eventually reached the neighborhood. By then, most people had moved on, focusing on building a safer, kinder environment for everyone. Whether Karen would return or start fresh elsewhere remained unknown. But one thing was clear: her story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how important it is to resolve conflicts peacefully. In the end, peace returned to the sleepy suburb, though it carried a newfound depth. Neighbors greeted each other with warmer smiles, knowing they had weathered a storm together. And Mr. Thompson, he continued living his quiet life, grateful for second chances, for himself, for his community, and perhaps even for Karen. After all, every story has lessons to teach, and theirs was no exception.